Good morning, everybody. We're just going to wait a minute just to give people an opportunity to log on. And I just want to say thank you for joining us this morning and for the Alberta Prairie Conservation Forum's webinar series. And this one being, Shall We Gather at the River with Lorne Fitch. So we'll wait a minute and then we'll get into things. And I hope you guys are all having a great morning. I see our attendees are slowly going up here. All right, well, we're at 10:01, and so I'm going to, and it's a pleasure for me to introduce to you all Lorne Fitch. I've had an opportunity to work with Lorne, as I'm sure many of you have as well. Maybe you're fortunate as I was, but Lorne is a professional biologist, and he has been for the last 50 years working on many issues related to the use of land and water. He's a retired provincial fish and wildlife biologist and was one of the co-founders of the stewardship initiative Cows and Fish. And that's how I knew Lorne, as I worked with him as a technician with Cows and Fish. And he is also an adjunct professor with the University of Calgary. Lethbridge is his home now, and where he pens articles and essays on issues related to Alberta's landscape and critters. So without further ado, I am going to pass over the screen to Lorne, and we will get to hear from him. Just give me 1 minute here. I am having, there we go. And once I get over there, okay, Lorne, here comes the request to make your presenter. And I'm going to turn off my mug and we'll get the presentation underway.
Well, thank you, Sasha, for that introduction. And thank you, Sasha, for that introduction. I hope I'm being heard by people. Good morning, folks. It's a rainy day in Lethbridge and we're reveling in the rain. Prairie people should never turn their noses up at rain. I'd like to take you through a conversation this morning about irrigation and the future of Southern Alberta's rivers, particularly related to a proposal by the irrigation sector for a either expansion or modernization project, depending on your perspective, that is proposed for Southern Alberta and of course has implications for our rivers. But before I describe a lot of that, I think it would be worthwhile providing a little bit of background on irrigation. So this is a little bit of background on Irrigation 101. One of the things that we have to recognize is that irrigation has a long-standing history in Southern Alberta, well over 100 years now. And the utility of it is certainly recognized in terms of our economy. The irrigation sector relies on on-stream reservoirs, like Waterton Reservoir here, St. Mary's Reservoir, and the Oldman Reservoir would be other examples of on-stream headwaters reservoirs that collect and store water for further use. For those of you in the Bow watershed, those dams and reservoirs that you're perhaps familiar with aren't irrigation reservoirs. They have been built and are used for hydroelectric generation, although they obviously have some benefit in terms of regulating downstream flows. Those irrigation reservoirs also are connected to the irrigation system with a series of diversions. And so big and little diversions that literally take water out of the river and put it into the irrigation districts for subsequent use. The water is also stored in off-stream reservoirs within the irrigation districts to provide more storage capacity for crop growing in those areas. Now, the footprint of the irrigation infrastructure in southern Alberta, I think, is mind-boggling for those that have had the opportunity to think about it, to drive beside it, or fly over it. And what irrigation has literally done is replumbed the landscape of southern Alberta. There are 15 reservoirs that are owned by the province of Alberta, 41 reservoirs that have been built with provincial funding in various cost share alternatives of irrigation districts, and about 8,000 kilometers of canals. So it really is a diverse, complicated system to try and figure out how water gets from the headwaters to a field somewhere near Medicine Hat, for example. Now, irrigation has evolved substantially since its tentative beginnings at the turn of the last century, from flood irrigation, shown in the black and white photograph, to wheel move irrigation, shown on the right, to pivot irrigation, in this case with downspouts that increase the efficiency. And as you can imagine, the efficiency of irrigation systems in terms of water diverted versus what actually gets onto a crop has improved dramatically. The down tubes for irrigation pivots increase the efficiency to about 85%. And so this has been a transformative aspect for southern Alberta's landscape. And the amount of irrigation, the amount of acreage under irrigation has been transformative in terms of the changes to the way that we use the landscape and the way we use southern Alberta's rivers. The irrigation is primarily done through irrigation districts. There are 13 irrigation districts, and some irrigation that's done privately off of rivers. The total is about about 2 million acres under irrigation. And the map there shows you the areas that are primarily under irrigation agriculture. The crops grown under irrigation include everything from cereals and forages to specialty crops, potatoes, for example, and sugar beets being some of those specialty crops. The thing that I think the irrigation sector likes to promote is that irrigation is a reliable prevention for famine, and that irrigation is feeding a hungry world. And although it makes great slogans, I think the reality is that irrigated crops in Alberta produce forage for cows, potatoes for chips, wheat for cookies, that's soft white wheat, and sugar beets to flavor soft drinks like Coca-Cola. So I want to point this out to you, that mainly irrigation agriculture does not provide us in southern Alberta, or even Albertans, food. This is primarily an export business. Now, to accomplish this requires the diversion of water. And the 13 irrigation districts are licensed. There are water licenses that have been issued to them over time, and they can withdraw half of the mean annual natural flow of southern Alberta rivers. Now, the licensed amount is that they generally use about 60 to 70% of that allocation except in dry years when most of that allocation is used. The other half of the flow, by an allocation agreement or an apportionment agreement with Saskatchewan, has to go beyond our borders into Saskatchewan and beyond. And so this is recognition that Alberta is a headwaters province, providing water not only to us in the eastern portion of our province, but to Saskatchewan and Manitoba as well. And I would point out that in about half of the years of record, the allocation volume exceeds the amount needed to meet the apportionment agreement with Saskatchewan. So we are using our rivers very, very heavily. And that has had some significant impacts on aquatic health. And these have been documented in several reports. The South Saskatchewan River Basin Water Management Plan pointed out that our rivers are stressed, they're significantly degraded, and it's predicted that that will continue in terms of the decline in river health below irrigation dams and diversions. The Aquatic and Riparian Conditions Assessment confirmed those findings, as did the State of the Watershed reports for the Bow and Oldman basins. So the bottom line is it flows because of irrigation withdrawals, primarily, do not meet the needs of the aquatic environment. Now, how much water should be left in our rivers? There are three acronyms that I think would be worthwhile exploring. The first IFN is in-stream flow needs. Now, this is an ecological metric, a measurement of how much water should remain in the year in any given season to ensure that the aquatic environment is protected, that it continues to survive and thrive. The other two, WCO and IO, WCO is water conservation objective, IO is in-stream objective. These are frankly administrative mechanisms because there isn't enough water left after these allocations to meet in-stream flow needs. So these are the mechanisms that have been tried to be used to somehow ensure that the rivers don't die. And I'm going to point out that they have been, frankly, failures at providing any measure of riparian or ecological or aquatic health. The reason that they fail is in the flow hydrographs. This is the St. Mary's River near Lethbridge. Blue is the in-stream objective, which is actually the absolute minimum flow that can be allowed to happen to deal with other water users. The WCO is in red or pink, and as you might discern, we can't even meet the in-stream objectives, the absolute minimum flow, let alone the water conservation objective, particularly during the summer irrigation period. When we look at the Oldman River near the mouth, these are water conservation objectives, still failures, particularly during the summer period, to meet even those administrative flow objectives. And what this means, and the Bow River near the mouth is another example of that. It means that flows are very low, water temperatures rise, dissolved oxygen levels go down, and this is not the way to meet any sort of objectives for maintaining aquatic health. The South Saskatchewan River at Medicine Hat shows the same pattern. And so these indicate that we have allocated too much water. We cannot meet even the basic requirements for river health with administrative flow objectives. What does this look like? Well, you can see on the left the Bow River in June. This is sort of the spring peak coming down, and then look at the Bow River in July. This is near Bow City on the Bow River. When we think about the Oldman, now these photographs are pre-Old Man Dam days, but they still exemplify the issues. The Old Man River in October shows what a normal flow regime should look like post the use of irrigation flows. The bottom photograph shows what it looks like in August, or did look like in August, and even worse, this is what the Old Man River looked like in July during some of those very dry years. And so this is an example of over allocation, of not responding to the needs of rivers, and perhaps of other water users other than the irrigation sector. These have had impacts not only in terms of river health. You can see a healthy riparian area on the Bow River, and then on the St. Mary's River, because of very reduced flows and sustained reduced flows over the season, the death of the cottonwood community, which provides biodiversity benefits. And for any of you that recreate in river valleys, having those cottonwood communities is a wonderful place to be on a hot August day. Of course, there are species in our rivers like lake sturgeon that are now threatened. They've been designated as a threatened species because of issues like low flows. And the prognosis is not good in terms of their continual survival under a regime of continual high allocations and low flows. And to put a fine point on this, using a Gary Larson cartoon, aquatic health declines as flows do. And so we can't expect aquatic health to be maintained with very high allocations for any use, but particularly irrigation, because it is the largest user of water from diversions out of our southern Alberta rivers. So what are the limits? And I think this becomes the fundamental question, because we have not been able to scratch a line in the sand and stick with that in terms of allocation of water. Yes, we do have a moratorium now on further diversions of the South Saskatchewan River Basin, but that happened after too much water was already allocated. And so when it comes to having a conversation about this latest proposal by the irrigation sector for a modernization or expansion scheme, I think we need to ponder a variety of things. First of all, though, I think we need to think about what is this initiative about? Well, from the irrigation sector, it's touted as saving water, to build more storage. They don't tout it as an expansion project, and yet the potential is indicated for irrigation expansion of 230,000 acres. It's a big project, nearly $1 billion, 70% funded by irrigation districts based on a loan from the Canada Development Bank, and 30% funding by the Alberta government. What it is, in terms of the modernization activities, are things like canal rehabilitation, changing canals to pipelines, new pipelines, and 4 off-stream reservoirs, some expansion of existing ones and some new. Now, this isn't necessarily a bad idea in terms of ensuring that we make better and more efficient use of water diverted. Old canals that seep, that aren't lined, have caused a variety of problems, including soil salinization, which is a sterilization of the soil. And so putting pipelines in replacement of those leaky canals isn't necessarily a bad idea. But when it comes to how do we use the water, whether it's saved water or water as part of the allocation, what we should be thinking about is what are the implications of climate change? Because that is going to be the huge driver of whether or not irrigation can persist either in its current state or expanded to 230,000 more acres. The reality is that flows, these are natural flows in our rivers, are declining. This line from 1912 to 2005 indicates that flows are generally declining, probably somewhere in the arena of 10 to 20%. There's no question that that line probably is going to continue. And because the licenses for irrigation are a volume amount, as you can imagine, their volume stays the same in terms of their licenses, but the amount of water in the river declines. And so sooner than later, we hit a tipping point where perhaps all of the allocation for irrigation will take up what's left in the rivers. So what does this mean in terms of our present and our future? Well, summer flows in the Bow and Old Man rivers have declined 40 to 60% due to withdrawals, primarily irrigation withdrawals. Climate change modeling says that there's going to be a continual decline in natural annual flows. And on top of that, there's decreased snow accumulation, particularly in the Bow watershed, there's melting glaciers. And remember, part of our water in the Oldman Basin comes from melting glaciers in Glacier National Park in Montana, which are nearly completely melted. And of course, with higher temperatures, which is predicted with climate change, there will be increased evaporation and evapotranspiration. And so under historic drought scenarios, so this is modeling what we know from the past and projecting it into the future, the demand for water could exceed supply. And the other thing under these scenarios is that it indicates that droughts that last more than 2 years cannot be mitigated with reservoir storage. And so building more storage is like running faster and faster, but staying in the same place and inevitably falling behind. And so what we can learn, particularly from the Colorado River Basin in California, systems that have been extensively engineered with engineered structures to store water, is that you cannot build enough infrastructure to store enough water to meet demand. So what you have to do is start to deal with that demand side rather than the supply side. And we can recognize this from our own watersheds because we have gone through droughts, periodic droughts, droughts within living memory that have given us reservoirs that are very much reduced in scope and scale and beyond the ability sometimes to even extract enough water to satisfy needs. The advice from people like John Pomeroy, a noted hydrologist, and I'll just read his quote here. He said, "It's important to look at the whole thing before expanding irrigation in one part or managing it differently in another part, and we're going to have to do that always with an eye to the mountains." And what John's advice is related to climate change and also about understanding what the implications of water delivery from the headwaters, which are our mountains, is going to be in the future under the aspects of climate change. And if we fail to do that, we probably run the risk of ensuring that systems no longer are useful for our purposes. We're going to run into more conflicts over water, and inevitably we're going to dry up our rivers. Now, just to give you some sense of this, for those of you who have not spent much time on prairie rivers, I have, and they are unique systems. They're water in a dry land. They're particularly diverse. This is the Red Deer River near Tolman Bridge. This is the Red Deer River downstream of Dinosaur Provincial Park. And this is the Big Bend on the Red Deer River near Buffalo. So these are extensive systems with their own beauty, their own biodiversity, and they function to provide a conduit for animals through a dry land. These include the South Saskatchewan River, and of course the activities that I've undertaken include canoeing and enjoying particularly those cottonwood communities which provide a place to camp, a place to understand the rivers, and a place to share in the biodiversity that these places provide. This is the confluence of the Red Deer and South Saskatchewan rivers. These are also famous for their archaeological sites, and so cultures before us revered these particular landscapes. Prairie rivers include the Milk River, and sometimes a canoe trip on the Milk River isn't a float, it's a push. And on the other side, the picture of the Bow River, again, with all of these unique perspectives. And these are rivers that provide us, I think, a sense of wild. They are rich in wildlife, and they provide us a sense of history, as the buffalo skull shows from the confluence of the Red Deer and South Saskatchewan River. Probably one of the buffalo killed in the time that Peter Fiddler operated a Hudson's Bay trading post at the confluence of these rivers. So where are we going with this? Well, I think Ogden Nash said it best. He said, progress may have been all right once, but it went on too long. We have over-allocated the flow in our rivers. We can't meet even basic in-stream objectives to maintain the aquatic environment. And if we continue to withdraw water and expand irrigation, we will run these rivers even further into an ecological deficit, and we may put at risk the very agricultural innovations that irrigation has provided. So in this conversation we should ask some fundamental questions. One can be, can the saved water, the water that will be saved from better and more efficient uses of diverted water, can some of that be left in the river to provide better in-stream flow needs? Could irrigation districts relinquish part of their licenses in recognition that they have been allocated too much water and that the health of rivers suffers because of those water licenses? I think a big question is, what is a fair and equitable sharing of water? Should irrigation get the lion's share? Should they continue to get the lion's share? And should they continue to get even a larger share? Part of that is, what are the ecological limits to irrigation use? I don't think anyone is suggesting that irrigation should be disbanded, but should it be expanded? And that is a fundamental question. How are species at risk affected by low river flows? Because we have an obligation legally and morally to ensure that species at risk don't wink out. Now, should we look at basin-wide aspects to assess this particular initiative of modernization and expansion? For example, should we be looking at the headwaters and thinking about what are we doing in the headwaters, particularly with clear-cut logging that changes the hydrologic regime? And part of that would be, will an environmental impact assessment be part of the decision process? And if so, how wide a scale will that impact assessment be? And lastly, will native grasslands, which are already an imperiled landscape, be impacted by this modernization or expansion project? And I suppose lastly, because irrigation has depended for construction and for operation on the public purse, who pays and who benefits? And that is a question that I think all Albertans should participate in. And that's why an impact assessment should be part of this, so that it broadens the conversation to people outside of the irrigation sector. I'll leave you with one additional thought. And this is not, and I hope this presentation isn't going to be construed as anti-irrigation. I think irrigation has provided all sorts of benefits, and I don't think that we can turn away from those benefits. However, how much more should we do, and have we already done too much? Because it gets to be like this famous painting by Frederick Remington entitled "Fight for the Water Hole." Will we fight over the last drops of water, or will we have an adult conversation about what some natural limits are, and a conversation about how we can accommodate things like the health of rivers as part of these modernization schemes, instead of expanding irrigation to the detriment of our rivers? I hope this has been useful, and thank you for your time this morning, and I'd be happy to answer questions.
Thank you very much, Lorne. That was fantastic. And I'm hoping, in my introduction, I, of course, forgot to say, please type in questions as they come up in your brains while listening to Lorne. But right now we can do that as well. You guys can either type into the question box, or if you put your hand up, I could also unmute you so that you could directly ask Lorne your question. And I'm just going down to the question box to see if there's anything there. There isn't at the moment. There's a couple different boxes here. And then I'll go back to the attendees. And I have Catherine too to help me navigate these questions as they come up. And I'm not seeing any right now. Hopefully there's somebody that comes forth with a question, as this is I do. So Maureen Bell has asked one. Let me see what your question is, Maureen. I just gotta go there. Oh, there we go. Okay, so this is from Maureen Bell. Do we know whether the Old Man Dam has actually benefited the river in the long term, is her question.
Boy, that's a presentation in itself, Maureen. I think that if you look at river flows, that becomes the final arbiter of whether or not the dam has benefited the Old Man River, particularly downstream. And particularly if you look at hydrographs for this year, you'll see that flows in the Old Man River at Lethbridge are still below normal spring flows, because as a function of this year, so much water has been stored in the Old Man Reservoir that normal spring flows have not occurred. And of course, that has some implications for things like cottonwood regeneration, flushing out sediments, providing the type of flows that fish species require for spawning. And so perhaps in some years that's been a benefit, but if you use this year as an example, the Old Man Reservoir has been operated primarily to benefit irrigation interests, and not necessarily downstream portions of the river for other purposes.
All right, Lauren. Thank you for that. There's a few more questions, or they're coming in as you've been chatting. And so the next question is from Emily Herdman, and she says, thanks, Lauren. Are there any data gaps that need to be filled in order to consider the use of water for irrigation and other needs?
Good question, Emily. I'm sure as is the case with virtually every other thing in natural resource management, there are data gaps. I would think that one of the primary data gaps is related to continual measurement of how the aquatic environment responds to these now persistent low flows. You know, we've done a little bit of work, or the Alberta government has done a little bit of work at that, but we really we lack substantial long-term data on what the trends are in aquatic community health, be it aquatic invertebrates or fish. And because fish are bellwethers, because you know they are the ultimate way that we can tell whether or not we're managing watersheds well. If we don't monitor fish populations in terms of health, distribution, and so forth, we won't really know whether or not our management systems are working. And so that, to me, is a fundamental data gap.
All right, thank you, Lorne. A couple more questions here from David Peltzer. Do you feel that the minimum flows past dam, which are part of our licenses, not enough of a safeguard for our river?
Quick answer, no, because we don't actually adhere to in-stream flow needs levels, which are the proper biological and ecological metrics to define whether or not river health has been assured. We're using these administrative mechanisms of water conservation objectives and in-stream objectives, which really are the fallback when you don't have enough water, when you've allocated too much. And so this is why we need to monitor the aquatic health in our rivers better, because I think it would tell us a somewhat dismal tale about our failure to keep enough water in our rivers.
Thank you, Lauren. And so Maureen had just, in response to your answer, said thank you. It is expected the argument for increased storage will be long-term benefit for the river flow. Your answer helped understand that. And then another thank you from Emily. She said, great answer. And I'm just seeing if there's any other questions. Currently there is not. We'll maybe just give a few extra seconds, minutes here for anybody that may be madly typing one in, and there is one. So Dean Wetzel, thank you for your question. He asks, how does this fit or not fit into the South Saskatchewan River Plan?
Well, if the South Saskatchewan River Plan, I think maybe missed the mark in terms of providing us some real metrics of what we need to do to march into the future. And one of them would be whether or not, and this is why some of my final questions were related to how much is enough. And what the South Saskatchewan River Plan, the River Basin Plan, should have done was start to sketch out what are the limits to growth. And that would include expansion of irrigation. Certainly the moratorium on more diversions was helpful, but it still doesn't deal with the fact that we have actually over-allocated our systems. And in recognition of that, what do we want for the future? You know, do we completely sacrifice rivers for irrigation, or do we find another place where irrigation interests at a certain level of growth or a place can be accommodated and still ensure that our rivers have some level of protection. So, you know, without those very definitive points, we're still struggling. And in fact, this is where we're at now with this modernization / expansion scheme, because it doesn't define how much water should be allowed to remain in the river, especially under the auspices of things like this modernization scheme, which is about irrigation efficiency. In other words, if the Alberta public is paying for part of this, should they expect that part of their contribution is recognized by more water being left in the river?
Okay, Lorne, we have quite a few more questions that are rolling in as you've been speaking. And so the first one is from Arlene Kwasniak, and she says, I've always contended that return flow conditions or expectations can form part of the actual allocation permitted in a license. This is the usual interpretation in most of the Western US. What do you think about exploring this with respect to the irrigation expansion project?
Well, it's interesting that return flows are always seen as somewhat the get out of jail free card. My issue is that if you divert water out of the Belly or Waterton or St. Mary's River and essentially dry it up to the point that cottonwoods die on the banks, and give some of that water a ride through the irrigation infrastructure and then dump it back into the South Saskatchewan River at Medicine Hat, have you really improved things? Yes, it may help us meet our apportionment agreement with Saskatchewan, but it does not affect river health in that stretch between the diversion point and the point that return flow comes back into the river.
Okay, thank you, Lorne. So this is from Emily Herdman, and she asks, as a citizen rather than a researcher, what levers can I push on to support change making and deeper consideration in this area? You asked a lot of questions that should be considered, and clearly they are not.
Well, I think one of the fundamental things is that the Alberta paying public should be afforded an opportunity to provide input and comment on initiatives like this in a forum where that input and that comment is going to be weighted correctly and not simply discounted because the Alberta public isn't a directly affected party. I think that is the way that we affect change in this, so that the Alberta public, conservation interests, and frankly other water users other than the irrigation sector have a fair shot at their voices being heard in decisions about how we manage water, and particularly allocate water from Southern Alberta's rivers.
Okay, thank you, Lorne. Another question from David Peltzer. Just wondering why your slide for river flow data stopped at 2005.
Simply because that's the data that I had available to me to make the slide.
Okay. And then another question from Levi Williams Whitney. I've heard from some anglers that they believe the dams, Old Man Dam in particular, has improved the quality of fishing along the rivers. What would your response be to the angling quality of Southern Alberta rivers impacted by dams, and to what evidence would you direct those folks to? Thank you.
Well, there's no question that one of the benefits, and I'm not sure that you would want to put this in capital letters of the Old Man Dam, was that downstream for a number of kilometers, a tailwater fishery of rainbow trout occurred. which has been rather successful, although not a particularly planned event. In some cases, those tailwater fisheries have been beneficial, but if you compare the tailwater fishery of the Old Man, below the Old Man Reservoir, to the 43.2 kilometers of river valleys inundated and the loss of blue ribbon trout fisheries in those 43.2 kilometer river stretches, it's hard to find big benefits. And if you look at the situation below Waterton Dam, below the diversion on the Belly River, and to a degree in the St. Mary's River, I think you would see that fish populations have not responded in positive ways, and in fact, longer reaches of the river because of chronic low flows have driven fish populations to very low points and have actually resulted in the loss of some species, like bull trout, as an example, from those reaches. So, you know, it depends on how you manage these reservoirs. And the point is, these reservoirs are not managed for downstream benefits for fish. They are managed to accommodate irrigation interests and to a degree some other water users, but not the aquatic environment.
Okay, Lauren, we have one more question here, and it's from Dean Wetzel. From your presentation, I assume that an environmental impact assessment has not been undertaken. Is this correct?
Not to date, no.
Okay. All right. And I believe that is all the questions that we have right now. And I'm just going to scroll through the attendees to see if there are any hands risen. And there are not. So that is another way that you could ask a question if you would like. Or I will give one more minute for questions to Lorne. And while we're waiting for that, I want to thank you so much, Lorne, for taking this time to present for us and sharing this information with everyone, and hoping that for those that want to reach out and become more involved, that you do. And just so that you know that we'll be posting this presentation. It has been recorded, and we'll be posting it on our website. And so if you wanted to share with other people, that is fine to do so. I think, Lauren, I don't see any more questions in the question box. I'll quickly check the chat, and I think that might be it for questions. I'm going to scroll through the attendees one more time for hands raised. No, I think that you've answered everybody's questions and provided us with a fantastic presentation here on a Monday morning with lots of rain and drizzle. And yeah, with that, I hope everyone has a fantastic summer. Lauren, do you have any closing remarks that you would like to give?
First of all, thanks to the Prairie Conservation Forum for this opportunity. It fits so nicely with the mandate of the Prairie Conservation Forum, and it recalls that prairies just aren't grassland, they're also the rivers that flow through grasslands and give value to those grasslands. And so I hope this has sparked some thought, and I hope it sparks a conversation about this modernization expansion initiative that might expand into a larger conversation about irrigation agriculture and how we have allocated precious resources, often to the detriment of natural resources. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Lauren. Everybody have a wonderful Monday and enjoy your summer. Take care.